Hello and welcome to Non-Inkables. Today we're going to talk about a concept that I recently came across that I think is very interesting and I wanted to share with you. And it's about levels, sometimes referred to as level thinking. And so I first came across this in a last set when I was reading the Ruby Amethyst guide, and it is mentioned in there. And then that led me to an article by Star City Games. So if you've heard of like SCG Con, they're the people who run that, and they have an article about it, which I will link below. And then I also saw I think I was watching some like YouTube videos about how to shuffle better. And then one of the suggested videos was about levels and how to like level up your game in Star Wars. And yeah, so it kind of somehow got suggested it from multiple different places. So level thinking comes from a book called The Theory of Poker, which was written in 1978 and is like considered like one of the must-read books for poker players, I guess. And it basically kind of describes like different levels in which people play. So it is levels 0 through 4. So I'll talk about each and then try to give examples of each one. And each level essentially has more meta, not in the sense of like when we normally talk about meta in Lorcana is like what decks are being played, but meta more in terms of like self-awareness. So more in like the, I guess, philosophical sense. So let's just get into it. It's kind of hard to give a good overview. So level 0 is sometimes termed goldfishing, which I think refers to like the game Goldfish, but I don't know. And the question that level 0 players ask is, what do I have? So it's in Lorcana, it would be playing your cards efficiently without considering like what your opponent is playing. So that's applicable to a lot of aggro decks. And it is definitely how I play when I'm really tired. And so I just go, okay, I have 2 ink. I will play my 2 ink character. I have 3 ink. I will play my 3 ink character. And you just play your cards in the best sequence for your deck without considering what your opponent could potentially have to counter you, right? It also implies that you are just inking cards and you're not really thinking ahead like, oh, I might need this card in a few turns. You're just like, okay, I'll just ink this since I'm not going to use it immediately and I'll play this. Okay, so that is level 0. Level 1, the question it centers around is what could my opponent have? So then you are adjusting your strategy based on what your opponent might play. So you have to think about what things might be in your opponent's deck based on the colors that you know they're playing, and then how you would counter those moves. And then also thinking about like what to ink. So for example, if you're playing against, say, red-purple, you know that on turn 7 that they have be prepared. So if you are doing level 1 thinking, you're thinking like, okay, my opponent might have be prepared on turn 7. So on turn 6, I'm not going to play a bunch of characters that are just going to get removed next turn. If you're playing against like a deck that has steel, you know that turn 5, they can play grab your sword. Or maybe if they have like an aerial singer out, you could sing that on turn 4. Or if they're playing like a blue steel deck and they have a fishbone quill out, even though right now they have 3 ink, next turn they may be able to ink and then ink again with fishbone quill and may be able to play grabber swords, right? Other examples would be like you're playing against amethyst steel and they have like a little Jafar out. They may have a big Jafar and they might try to do the Jafar wheel thing and get lore that way. Another example from like this set would be if you're playing like a steel deck that has that peat that prevents actions from being played, you are playing against a song deck, like an amber steel deck, you would play your steel so that that aerial can't sing, and they also wouldn't be able to play Naveen and get a song for free. So you're thinking about what your opponent could have, and you change your strategy based on what you think they might play, right? So I think there are a lot of examples of that. It's like basically instead of reacting to your opponent, you are almost like anticipating what they could play. Level 2, so next level would be thinking like, what does my opponent think that I have? And so in that level, you are making plays that you're trying to basically send out signals to your opponent about your strategy, and you're maybe bluffing, right? And so you're trying to use bluffs to make your opponent misjudge what you're actually trying to do. And then another way to think about it is like you're playing these small cards that could become bigger threats. And so you're trying to get your opponent to use their removal on your little cards. So an example of this is like if you play the 1-drop Robin Hood, right? Your opponent is like, oh, he probably is going to shift this into Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood. Or you play like the 3-drop Tinkerbell, and your opponent is like, oh, they might shift this into the big Tinkerbell, right? Or maybe you play the 3-drop Sisu in Ruby, Emboldened Warrior, and they're like, oh, maybe they're going to shift this into the big Sisu. And so they're like, okay, I have to deal with this immediately before it becomes a bigger threat that I can't get rid of. Another instance, I guess, where I see this a lot is like Amber Steel decks. They'll play on turn 1 like a 1-drop Robin Hood. On turn 2, they'll play a 1-drop Cinderella and a 1-drop Queen. And you're like, which one is going to be the shift target, right? Like, which of these starter Pokemon are you going to turn into the bigger threat? And so it's almost like there's some decks that I've seen that play like, say, the 1-drop Robin Hood, but they don't even have the shift line. I think Spessy ran a deck that was purple steel that played the 1-drop Robin Hood. He didn't even have the big Robin Hood in it. It was mainly just to bait out the opponent's removal. So you're making your decisions to try to have your opponent play things based on what you think your opponent thinks you have. So I feel like in a lot of these levels, it's a lot of like, what do you think your opponent thinks that you think, like back and forth. So it gets a little confusing. But that's basically level 2. Level 3 is, what does my opponent think I think he has? So this is like a much deeper level. It has more mind games. And it's like you predict what your opponent thinks your strategy is, and then you try to exploit things like that. So you're trying to mislead your opponent about your real strategy. So kind of like level 2 where you're bluffing, but just more steps ahead. So the examples I thought of this were like if you are playing some sort of Ruby deck and you play not very many characters. So you keep your board pretty narrow. Maybe you don't use all of your ink. And then your opponent is like, okay, why is my opponent not going wide? Maybe my opponent has Be Prepared and they're going to play that soon. And so they don't want all their characters to die. So they're just saving those characters that they're going to play after their Be Prepared, right? Or if you are playing Blue Steel and you start inking Hurons, and so then you are trying to make your opponent think that, oh, you're going to play A Whole New World. So you're inking cards that normally would draw cards because you don't need them, because you're going to play A Whole New World. And then maybe you don't actually have A Whole New World, and so then your opponent starts to ink all their draw cards because they think, well, I'm just going to get new cards when you play A Whole New World, so I don't need these cards. But in reality, maybe you don't actually have A Whole New World or something. I feel like level 3 really only works if your opponent is at least a level 1. So they have to be aware and be thinking about what your strategy would be against them for you to be able to trick them into thinking something else. And then the last level is level 4, which is, what does my opponent think I think he thinks I have? Which the first time I read it, my literal comment was just like, what? So it's, what does my opponent think I think he thinks I have? So this is the highest level of strategic thinking. It has like multiple layers of bluffing, counter bluffing, and you're doing like a lot of strategy with multiple layers. It's very advanced. It's quite rare. I don't know even if the example that I thought or that Brian helped me think of is really a level 4 example, if it's actually a lower level example. But it's when I was doing more research about this, one place described it as like thinking several steps ahead to outmaneuver your opponent's strategy. So Brian thought of an example of it's like playing in a certain way that makes people think you're playing a certain deck. So I think maybe less so for this set, but in previous sets, like you going, like say set 4, going in, if they play Diablo turn 1, right? You're like, okay, this is probably going to be like a green steel deck. They're going to play Bucky. They're going to shift their Diablo, and so your deck has a way of, like, say I was playing red-purple. So the red-purple way of dealing with that would be to only play cards that draw cards and to keep inking until you can get to be prepared, right? But maybe they're actually not playing that standard Bucky Diablo deck. Like, there were some decks, I think especially towards the end of the set, that had like Curse Merfolk, it had Prince John, it had all these differences from the standard deck. And so you think they're doing this thing that that green steel decks do, and then they don't do it. I don't know if that really is an example of level 4, but it's kind of, otherwise I would have no examples for level 4, because I'm like, I'm not that good, so I don't even know what this would be. So yeah, those are the 4 levels. When I first came across them, actually, it reminded me of school and multiple choice exams, and I think part of why I was a good exam taker in school. Because a lot of times I don't know the answer for the multiple choice test, right? And then I just think, like, if I were going to test students on this subject, what would I want to test them on? Like, what concepts would I think are important to test students on? And that is how I would answer my tests. So, for example, I think I was doing some practice questions with someone, and there was a test like, oh, there's one solitary lesion on this scan in the brain. Like, what could it be? And I would go through the answer, be like, okay, I don't think it's, or it would be like multiple nodules in the brain, whatever. And then I'd be like, okay, it's definitely not the solitary one. So that's X'd out. And I was like, I don't think they would test on this concept because it seems kind of like random and not important. And then I would basically be like, okay, I think it's this one because I think the other ones just seem weird. And this one I think is something they would actually test me on. Do I actually know that this is a fact and those two are correlated? No, but just based on thinking about, like, if I were writing this exam, this is what I would test people on. And that is how I would come to my choice. And so I feel like this, that kind of like thinking as the test maker, so in a sense, the opponent, is why I was so good at multiple choice tests. And I think it applies to playing TCGs. So that is level 0 through 4. I would definitely say when I first started, I was definitely level 0. And then maybe in set, I would say I started playing set 2. So maybe set 3, end of set 3 into set 4, I became more level 1. So I would think about what my opponent would have. And sometimes I still think I don't think that far. Even like in the middle of set 4, I felt like there were times where I would play something and then, like, for example, the blue steel example, where they would be at 3 ink and I would play like pretty wide. And then they would play, like, they would fishbone quill and then they would ink another card and they would be able to play grab your sword. And I would be like, oh, dang it, I forgot about that. And I know that, like, in one of the set champs I went to, I totally forgot about Be Prepared on 7 in Ruby Sapphire. And so I think sometimes I still am at level 1. And then only recently I feel like I've maybe gotten to level 2. So I feel like last set I often would use my castle, not to actually thinking like the castle would survive, but just to make them attack the castle. So I would put the castle basically as bait so that they would hopefully attack the castle instead of questing. And yeah, I think when I play against really good players, they're often at that level 3 where they are thinking about what I have, what they have, what I might think they have, what they think I have, they think whatever. Circle, circle, circle. And I feel like that is the difference, really, in terms of levels between, like, people who start playing and people who have been playing TCGs for a long time. And I think that's why a lot of these skills, like a lot of the people who play TCGs, who've played other TCGs and they come to Lorcana, that's why they can be good, like, pretty quickly. Because they think Lorcana is pretty easy to learn and they already know a lot of the nuances from playing other TCGs and it's like similar thinking. And so they can just apply what they've learned before to Lorcana. And so they're often already in that like level 2, level 3 thinking. But yeah, I think it's an interesting concept to think about and definitely something that kind of changed how I played and I feel like made me a lot better player. And so I wanted to share with you guys. Let me know what you think. What level do you think you play at? I definitely, when I'm tired, level 0, 100%. And so I'm trying to work on ways to not be there so often. And yeah, I will probably be doing a few more videos on things that I have learned from better players in this game so I can share with all of you. And as always, keep shuffling. Hopefully you don't end up with a whole handful of non-inkables like me. All right, bye.